Okay. So, of general interest is what is the role of government in providing these transportation networks? Because in the present, a lot of infrastructure is done by the government. So, you think the federal highway system, the LA subway, or whatever it's called, the metro. So these kind of like big transportation projects in the present are done by government. Now, the argument for them being done by government is typically because transportation is viewed as a public good. Um, and so we want to be very careful what that word means. So when I say public good, you may be thinking, okay, just good for anything that's good for the public. That's what the public good means, or anything provided by the government is a public good. That's not what we mean in economic history when we're talking about public goods. Public goods have a very, very specific definition. And basically, these are goods that, according to economic theory, will not be provided by the private market. That the companies will have no interest in doing these things because of what's called the free rider problem. And so when the cost of excluding people is high, what that means is, okay, how hard is it to figure out who gets the good? So if I'm making a sandwich, I hand the sandwich to the person. The cost of excluding someone else from running in and stealing the sandwich is low. That's just not going to happen. However, if I build a large public park, right? The cost, not if I build a large park, the cost of excluding is kind of high. I have to build walls. I have to have a security system. I have to have somebody patrolling it. And so in that case, it's very easy for somebody to use it without paying. So many firms would not be interested in that proposition. The classic example of a public good is the lighthouse. So you think about a lighthouse, shining a light, right? The purpose of a lighthouse, for those people who are not mariners, is, okay, there's some rocks here. So we put a lighthouse on the rocks so that ships know, hey, sail around this area. Don't get, don't get shipwrecked on the rocks. Now, the cost of excluding ships from seeing that light is high. If I'm running the lighthouse, how do I know if this passing ship has, say, paid for the lighthouse survey or not? So service, I have no idea, right? And so it's very difficult. So goods like this, where the private market just isn't going to do it, there's a role for government to provide these goods, provided that they're beneficial, provided that essentially the benefits outweigh the costs. So when we think about a transportation network, typically we think of it as being a public good by the classic definition of a public good. Because, well, think of a canal. It's kind of hard to stop. You could, but it's a little hard to stop people from using the canal, right? If I got a boat, I just hop in the canal, float down the canal. Who's stopping me? I actually had some friends, float down the Mississippi recently, on a raft. No one's going to stop you. It's hard to stop you. So at the cost of excluding people is high. I mean, theoretically you could do it, but it would just be high. You'd have to have a lot of whatever, boat cops to, I don't know what they're called. Police boats, patrolling the area. Coast Guard, is that what they are? Harbor Patrol? You know what I'm talking, boat cops. Come on. You know what I'm talking about. Now the other issue is, the other characteristic of a public good is typically they have this nice feature where they're what's called non-rival, where me using it, doesn't hurt you from using it. So it's you kind of get extra benefits. The government does it, and then everybody can benefit from it, because just because you're using it doesn't stop me from using it, right? So if you see the lighthouse, it doesn't stop me from seeing the lighthouse. If you're in the public park, as long as you're not bothering me, we can both enjoy the public park at the same time. With transportation networks, usually they're not crowded, so the fact that you're in the canal doesn't really stop me from using it, right? We can both kind of float along in the canal. Now, once it gets congested, then yes, then there is some sort of, I'm essentially the cost I'm imposing on other people. Now that doesn't become zero. This is what this means. The marginal cost of one more person using it is at zero. So essentially, if I use it, does it impose costs on anybody else? No. All right, the marginal cost is zero. It's what's called non-rival and non-excludable, which is the definition of a public good: non-rival, non-excludable. So kind of, even your most libertarian leaning people would say, okay, well, the government should do public goods. Like the government, there's a role here for the government to provide these things because they're not going to be provided by the private market. They're incredibly beneficial because the marginal cost of other people using them is zero. Now, what's interesting is kind of in this era, and this also occurred in England right before the Industrial Revolution. It's not like today where we have this highly developed government where the government has this like massive revenue, very large role. The state capacity here is very low, and so what's interesting is there were in these societies they were able to develop basically these things that in the present we think of as public goods privately through a variety of different mechanisms. So the federal government is not really involved in these initial transportation improvements, these transportation networks. And so there's, they essentially they want to, but then it's vetoed. And it's really not implemented until we get the Federal Highway Act. The Federal Highway Act, which 1946, I believe. They were not the highways. Most of the freeways in the U.S. are built in the 50s. They were approved in the 40s and then built in the 50s, and I think they're kind of done being built by 64. But that is a story for the next part of this class, the whatever 141B. Okay. All right. So basically, the federal government is not really doing anything. Okay. Now, the state and local governments are trying to do it. But mostly this is happening in the private sector. The private sector is building these canals, which are essentially essentially public goods. And the reason they're public goods is because it's really hard to exclude people from using it. The cost of excluding non-payers is high. If you don't pay for it, you could still use it a lot of times. You can sneak on there and use it. And again, the social rate of return, the rate of return for society is much higher than the private rate of return. This is what we call a positive externality, where, okay, they are really, really good for society. We build up these networks. Now it's easier to get things everywhere. It makes us more connected to all the other cities. It just encourages in trade and economies of scale. So that's really, really good for society. As the person who built the canal, if I say built the canal, it's hard for me to capture all those gains. And so my incentive to build the canal is low. And basically, they were able to overcome these problems. So there's no like one person or one firm that really has an incentive to build a canal because it's going to be really costly. It's going to be really hard to make money off of this. And the way they do that, they have to figure out some way for the people who build the canal to benefit. And so they do this through land speculation, essentially realizing that the land values are going to go up. And so being able to buy the land near the canal. Essentially forcing some of the businesses that will benefit from it. So, okay, you have a business in this town, we're going to come collecting from you. Hey, we've got to build the canal. Please contribute. Otherwise, we're going to, shame you, or you won't be able to use it. And so kind of like strong arming the businesses that will benefit to contributing to it. So essentially the local towns really pressured businesses, and then the people who built the canal able to buy up the land. And then some investment from the state and local governments that would really, really benefit from it. So, you think of a canal in New York, like the Erie Canal, that's really going to benefit New York State. It'll benefit the federal government indirectly, but that's really, really going to be a boon to New York. So it really, those state and local involved, there's much more state and local involvement rather than at the federal level. So that's basically how they kind of solve this, this thing that in the present is done by government. Again, the government wasn't developed, or there wasn't enough will for the government to do it. Basically, they also didn't really have the revenue capacity that we have in the present. I mean, like in the present, we'll get to this when we talk about tariffs, but it's just easier to tax people in the present. I mean, everything's all electronic. There's all these employer-employee relationships that are documented. So it's just easy for the government to come along and take the tax. This period is just much easier to dodge your taxes. I mean, you can still dodge your taxes in the present, as we all know. But it's just much easier in this time period. And so for that reason, actually, most of the revenue from the federal government here is from tariffs, which are hard to get out of. But there's like no income tax here back in this time period. All right. So we have these lower transportation costs as the U.S. develops this internal transportation network. Okay. And what comes from that is this increased urbanization. The value of land becomes higher as now it's easier to move things around. and the market size vastly increased. Like if I'm a productive firm, in upstate New York, and I'm really good at what I do, I used to only be able to sell locally. Now I can sell to, all of the Northeast. Um, this has advantages, obviously, for consumers. If I'm good at what I do, well, I can provide a higher quality product at a lower price. So consumers benefit, I benefit, obviously, as my company grows, and then as we get some economies of scale. All right, so we get the economies of scale, which is basically just as companies grow larger, they get more efficient. I'm kind of throwing this term around, just assuming you know what it is. But that's what it means. As a company gets larger, it gets more efficient. All right, we'll talk about market growth in after this.